Hello, everyone. Here we are with a lecture on gender and language, which syncs up with your book in Chapter 5. I'll tell you, as we move into the second unit of class, you're going to get a stronger sense of how I run the class, really how it's going to go, especially for the next two units, in which I'm not going to lecture a whole lot on the book. I will try to identify places where I think you might get stuck, but otherwise, I'm going to respond a lot to the questions that you've had. Otherwise, I'm not going to lecture the book a whole lot. As you'll see, I'll touch on a couple things today, but not a whole lot. Otherwise, what I'm doing is I'm adding some things in. And also, truth be told, we could just be honest here. This is typically one of those chapters where I have a nice activity that we do in class to work through some of these concepts. And just meeting synchronously once a week, it's probably not going to work out as well. And that's okay. I think it's going to be okay. But it's just yeah, just sort of missing being with you all today. All right, enough with that. Let's move into some content. Right. So as we're talking about gender and communication and language, the most fundamental idea we come to, right, is this notion of he and she. And the book talks about this. We've talked about it actually at the very beginning of class. The book addresses it at the beginning of this chapter. That our language has a certain, say the English language, has a real insistence that we recognize who's male and who's female. To indicate a singular person, we use what we typically call a masculine or a feminine, which we could talk about that, but still, we might say a male or a female pronoun, or we say a he or a she. And so think about the many times that this becomes complicated, because we just want to refer to a generic person. So think about the many times that when you refer to a person and there's no specific person you're thinking of, but you're thinking of just one person, the way you're pushed to either say he or to say she. And by the way, if you say she sometimes as opposed to he's a generic, people think you're just being difficult, right? Well, you should go see your doctor and see what she says. And people say, why do you have to be so difficult? He's the generic, which is a whole other thing we're going to talk about in a moment here, I suppose. Right? You do that, or otherwise it asks us just to rely on stereotypes of what we expect. Again, the doctor is male. Even just the other day, I had told my mother I'd hired somebody to come and do a little bit of work in our yard just to get me caught up with some trimming and things I'd gotten behind on. And my mom kept talking about this person who's coming over and saying, oh, well, whoever you have coming, maybe he can help with this, or you should ask him to do the other thing. And I kept saying, well, yeah, I've asked her to do this. And I've told her, because I had actually worked with somebody or worked out who's going to be coming over. But just generically, if you're referring to the person who'd be doing a little bit of work in the yard as a he, I didn't denounce my mother instantly as a sexist with whom I could no longer associate, obviously, right? But there is that pattern of we like to say he or she because that's a singular. In the English language, the really only convenient way that we have to refer to somebody without specifying gender is controversial in a couple of different ways. And that's to say, they. First, it's controversial only in that some people don't like the use of they. They feel like you should use he as a generic, or you should decide on it, or say he, she, as what other people, usually different people, will say. That's sort of one minor controversy. And the second controversy is a grammatical one. They is a plural word, and in place of he or she, it's a plural word being used for a singular. So this has been a little bit of an issue. By and large, many places, many institutions, uh, papers and so forth, newspapers, right, are increasingly accepting they as a good sort of generic to replace the he, she. And you should look in your textbook to see, right, that this is not a new debate. We have this long-standing problem of referring just to a generic individual and he and she being awkward, and the suggestion that we use the word they. So this is not a new suggestion at all. And in fact, many people who identify as non-binary prefer to use the they, them, their pronouns as opposed to he, him, his, or she, her, hers, right? We do actually have other options than he and she and even they. So if you look at that left column, you see the familiar variations of the female or feminine pronoun, and the middle column, the familiar male or masculine pronouns. And to the right, we have Z, here, here, here's, and hereself. And with all of these, they may seem sort of unfamiliar because they are, and might be difficult for us at first, but that's because of the problems we already have in our language. And once you get used to them, they will be set, right? And this is part of being considerate and inclusive and more accurate. And beyond this list, I have to say, people have actually developed a whole series of options for how we might approach some non-gender specific pronouns. As we look at these options, of course, two of them are very familiar to us, the he and the she. We sort of have that down pat. You can figure out this one pretty easily, the plurals, one I just discussed. But there's some others that people have also explored. I've mentioned this, right? This one here, I've mentioned this, right? Z or they, and here, right? We also have z, them, zir, zers, right? That's an option as well. You see here somebody said, well, what if we took person, right? And we use that, per self, right? My point is just to say that there are many options. We really haven't spent much time as a culture, as a society, coming up with what a good option would be, or what a good option would be. And so the variety of options is less about, oh my gosh, it's so complicated, than the fact that we've all been pretty stubborn to come up with a new option. That's really more of what this shows. As I say, however, right now culturally, most of us, what we're relying upon has been the use of they, right? All these right here. By the way, I'm not crossing out, I'm trying to highlight is what that's supposed to be, unless you think I'm trying to cross it out. So again, there are many options, but we really haven't spent the time to develop any. Relative to masculine and feminine that pop up in our language, and not even just our language, but you'll see here also in the Spanish language. So we have Latino and Latina, and it was the habit that for a long time, if you're referring to a community of people who identified as Latinos, male, and Latinas, female, you just say Latinos, right? Unless Latinas disappear. And so a term that has come into use, right, and we got a word to capture the idea of both male and female, and even to be ambivalent, not to say there's male and female, but to say, and just gender neutral, gender queer, right, not having to know, is Latinx, right? Latinx. So this is also, so this has been a way and a place where we've seen, all right, let's just take a root, do something different with it, and now we have this expression. That's what you'll hear me talk about sometimes, people who are Latinx or Latinx culture. That is why, as opposed to saying Latino or Latina, which are necessarily sexed or gendered. We have this expression as well, and we use this a lot when we're referring to those who have been marginalized by a culture that has largely been made and based around white men. And we say, we'll talk about how, for instance, a language has a tendency to least represent the experiences of women and people of color. Okay? But even the statement itself carries a certain sort of bias to it. Now, many a person uses this phrase and is well-meaning, right? So that when somebody, does something contrary to what I'm recommending here, I'm not saying we call this person out necessarily being a sexist or misogynist or a racist, but that it's a certain habit they've fallen into and not aware of. I used this expression for a while until I read something, and an article that was talking about the problems of saying women and people of color. Because people of color tells us men and women, right? We say people of color, we mean men and women. So who are these women then? Well, the assumption is that we're talking about white women, right? And it's actually okay to say it's like white women and people of color. But if you say women and people of color, what you've done is you said that females, right, women of color, they really aren't women. But what they are is they're people of color. And it's a way of maintaining woman, the idea of woman or of women, as being white. And it's not intentional, but it is a bias in the language that says, well, women and people of color. So the people of color are the male and female, right? So who are these women you're talking about? Well, it's the ones who aren't of color. Oh, I see, right. So that generic becomes a white. It may not be something that a person is doing consciously, right, or with a sort of intent, but it is demonstrating a certain bias in their use of language. And it's something we have to be aware of. And that's much of the takeaway here is being aware of our language choices and being open to change and to be more aware. And I mean, I guess I could say sensitive, but just to be more conscious, right? Not because sensitive makes it sound like, Well, I didn't realize it was going to be a problem for you, as opposed to more conscious of the choices that really are sometimes demonstrating some pretty clear bias against people. Not intentional, but we perhaps should be more intentional about our language use, especially if we're talking about issues of gender and sexuality and all the other components of our identity.